All right. Welcome, everyone. My name is Chris Gill. I'm located in Rochester, New York. I'm a Microsoft Azure MVP, and I work for a living at Nixon Peabody. I am joined here by my friend Abdul. Abdul, could you introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi there. My name is Abdul Kazi. I live in Toronto, Canada, so this is truly virtual. And I work for a Microsoft partner. And I've been in the Azure space for since 2014, and love working with the community and very active. And today we have our first ever speaker. So
Yay!
Shannon Kuehn, and then I'll let Shannon introduce herself.
Sure. So I'm Shannon Kuehn. A lot of folks might have seen me in a previous role where I was talking about Azure VMware Solution quite a bit and cloud adoption framework and things of that sort. I switched roles back in November of last year, and I'm now working in the identity program group at Microsoft. So similar role, I'm just sitting in an engineering team, and it's a different experience because we now align ourselves with divisional OKRs, and that helps out the other program managers who are trying to kind of move the mark with different products and services.
Great,
Awesome.
great.
Awesome.
So before we
Love it.
jump
You say,
to
oh, go ahead.
actual presentation, Shannon, just talk to us about, quickly what are you seeing in the market and how, identity is really evolving.
Yeah, so I think if you've paid attention to Microsoft, Charlie Bell came over to lead up the security. It's SCIM, so security, compliance, and identity management, right? And we now all report up to Charlie Bell versus Scott Guthrie. So Microsoft sought out to sort of differentiate the market on that front, pull us out of the Azure engineering org, and put us in the security, compliance, and identity management org. So it's interesting, right? I think this is one of those areas that folks always think about or they gloss over, or they purposely build things with plain clear text passwords put into deployment files, things of that sort, because people hate authentication and authorization. And the beauty is Microsoft has made a lot of this simpler over time, right? We've abstracted quite a bit. Some of what I'll talk about is interesting in the sense that it brings about an element of authorization, authentication, as well as securing that,
Mhm.
right? Especially if you are super savvy, because there are customers who are pretty savvy out there who are building out environments with managed identities, service principals, application registrations, right? And it's one of those things that, we just try and help folks realize it's not as difficult as it might seem, right? And I often say on our live streams, if I can do it, you can do it too. And I joke quite a bit that I'm sitting here with like my developer certs and I'm hitting REST APIs. And if you would have told me, 10, 15 years ago that I'd be at Microsoft, customers would trust the cloud and I'd be hitting REST APIs, I probably would have called BS. I said, that's not going to happen, whatever. And here I am eating my own words, right?
That's
That's
awesome.
fantastic.
So
Fantastic.
yeah, so I'll often say I play a developer on TV. Like you won't want to go to me for your code review. You'd actually want to go find a real developer. But I can talk to you about how to use the tools to make your really cool development code work well in Azure.
Awesome. Awesome. So, do we want to get started? Let's
Sure.
kick it off. All right. So, Shannon, you get, we're going to sneak.
Oh, let's see. Yeah, you completely did sneak away. So hang on, let me get everything up and functional on my end a little bit. Sorry. Thought I had it all the way ready to go. Okay. So I'm here today to talk about protecting your apps and services using Azure AD workload identities. And that's a little bit about, well, it's a very quick bit about me. I talked a little bit about who I am and what I've done. If you followed me over the course of time on social media, I have a very atypical background. I went to school for communication studies and English, fell into technology by way of being a DJ. And I got tired of my developer friends pulling my leg and making me reboot my computer 20 times to fix problems. And they were just mostly trying to see if I was going to reboot my computer. If you are really curious to follow what my team does on social media, connect with me on Twitter, connect with me on LinkedIn. I also share content there that's not just about our team and what we do. I try to share a lot of cool stuff because I'm a big believer of Azure and a big believer of Office 365 or M365. I it's weird. I've come back to this realm of sitting in between Azure and M365. And so I constantly say Office 365, but I think the better way of being more inclusive is M365. And then, as I had mentioned, I'm a senior program manager on the identity and network access advocacy team. Now, on my team, so we're part of the 425 show. And I often feel like maybe we should have picked a different name for this. The 425 response code is too early. And the reason it became the 425 show was one, well, the Seattle area code is 425. Two, it's, I guess, sort of one of those things where if you're a developer, you get that code pretty often. I'm not sure. And the two guys I work with on my team are definitely developers. They don't play one on TV. So it is the 425 show. We are always looking for tech influencers. So if you are a live streamer, content creator, social media influencer, or you're a blogger, reach out and connect with us. We love to collaborate. We're always looking for ways to fill in time because we do what are called swarms, right? So we conduct those probably about 6 times a year, 5, 6 times a year. So we have some downtime and we always like to sprinkle in extra bits from people who are a part of the community. So drop us a line on email, go to the website, learn a little bit more. We broadcast live on Twitch. We'll cut up the videos and put them up on YouTube. We're pretty active on Twitter. We're experimenting with TikTok and Instagram. Short form video is a thing now. And I often feel like it's just kind of COVID, kind of extended itself into this domain and we're playing around with it. And then we've also hosted hackathons on DevPost. So let's move into the topic at hand, workload identities. So software workloads continue to move to the cloud at a very rapid pace, right? If you think about where we are now versus when Abdul started in the cloud. I started in 2016, he was 2014. Think about the fact we're geriatric in the realm of Azure, right? But more and more workloads are moving to the cloud. And there are still some folks who are out there that are now thinking it's a great time to move to the cloud. And what we're seeing is a lot of these more savvy customers are choosing to build cloud native applications. So they're not choosing to lift and shift VMs. The developers are spinning things up net new inside of Azure. Now, these specific components, they're made up of applications, services, scripts, and daemons, right? So something that's not necessarily human led, but you need some sort of authentication mechanism in order to make a something happen within your environment, right? So there's this whole notion of needing to increase managing and securing workload identities. And I put quotation marks around it. This is the Gartner term, and we have chosen to roll it into Microsoft's documentation. And I believe Google even calls it workload identities as well. So if you think about Azure Active Directory, there are a couple of different, I guess, subheaders of the identities in Azure. So the taxonomy of identities in Azure AD, they're split up into two sections. So human identities and non-human identities, right? So your human identities are going to be your employees, your external users, could be B2B, B2C, right? If you're dealing with consumer-based applications. The intersection between those two lies in the realm of service accounts. And then if you think about your non-human identities, you'll have a device identity, you'll have an Internet of Things identity, and then the section that I'm going to be focusing on for the duration of this talk, the workload identities. So these are your applications, your service principals, your managed identities, your scripts, etc. So what are workload identities? Well, I'll read the slide here and then I'll kind of talk about it a bit. So a workload identity is an identity used by a software workload, such as an application, service, script, or container, to authenticate and access other services and resources. P.S. You've already been doing this if you know what a managed identity is, a service principal is, or an application registration. So rather than completely scrap what we've done for a number of years, we chose to sort of bucket them together and make them be something that's unified underneath one name, right? Because, we're Microsoft, we like to keep putting things underneath umbrellas and giving bigger names and trying to make things less complex. But if you hear the word workload identities, just know it's one of potentially three things: an application, a service principal, or a managed identity. So the application itself, it's an abstract entity or template. It's defined by the application object. A service principal is a local representation or an application instance of a global application in a specific tenant. And a managed identity is a special type of service principal that eliminates the need for developers to manage credentials. P.S. I think a lot of us would rather be in the managed identity realm, but not quite every single one of our services is ready for it. Or if it is ready, it's still kind of in that incubation state, meaning it's more in the public preview side of things. So if you were to think about this, an end-to-end scenario might be something like, let's say you're a banking customer and you've got an app with permissions to scan emails across the organization to flag any potential insider trading, right? There are apps that do this without having to roll your own, but let's say you've got those savvy developers in-house. That app would be useful for the organization, but it's also a potential liability if the app is compromised. And I think the big piece of this is these identities can be compromised. So there are challenges of managing and securing workload identities. So many of the traditional IAM capabilities don't apply to workload identities, right? You can't really respond to an MFA challenge if you are a managed identity, right? You are just doing it's not even a you, right? Managed identity is not necessarily a user. It's a managed identity by the way of the platform that you provision or whatever it could be a VM, could be storage, could be an app service, etc., right? It can't respond to an MFA challenge, right? So it's also one of those things where it's difficult to get visibility into the activity of the workload identity. So what is that identity doing? It just sort of runs, right? Not a lot of great telemetry, not a lot of great interesting ways of understanding what's happening as an application does a something with that authentication mechanism kind of sitting over top. It's also hard to do cleanup, right? Is that still being used? When was the last time it was used? It's hard to manage and maintain. There's also a higher potential for secrets or credentials to leak. So oftentimes customers will build a service principal and they won't necessarily reinvent the wheel. They'll keep that service principal with the corresponding secret until the end of time. That's not a really good security posture for your company, but it happens more than I'd care to admit, right? So that's an opportunity to think about, maybe we should look at some of this, but how do you? And then there's this whole idea too of there's some lacking capabilities for securing access. So how do you remove unnecessary or overprivileged access? Let's say you've got a service principal that has ownership rights to a subscription. That's a very big red flag. You would never want to have a service principal have that much elevated rights within your environment. So you might want to be flagged about that, right? So if you think about your environment here, do any of the following scenarios apply? And if they do, you will be getting big thumbs up from me, and you will probably also be putting your big thumbs up, excited about these newer features, right? So, do you have heavy app workload or heavy app or workload integration with Azure Active Directory? If so, stay tuned, right? If you are currently using Azure AD conditional access, identity protection, or access reviews to secure users, you are going to be excited about some of these newer features. Do you want to protect identities from compromise? I think the overarching answer in any company is yes, and probably yelling it too, right? And then are you subject to regulations or auditor visits? I was just talking about this recently. I almost feel like even the mom and pop shops of old are now subject to auditors just showing up, right? That's just the nature of the world we live in. The auditors and regulators, I don't know if they've been left in a room too long and they just all of a sudden start becoming, there's more auditors and more regulators coming about, but it just feels like that side of things is becoming more stringent. And so customers want to make sure that they're protected and that their security posture is in the right kind of realm to protect the environment. So we've got 4 new capabilities to protect workloads. I will say too, these just reached general availability. So a couple of my screenshots show the preview component. It just switched and I have to check the portal, and I meant to do that today and I just didn't get time. I think they've all now changed because everything reached general availability. So there's conditional access for workload identities. Kind of cool if you think about it, right? You can specify, you don't want this to run if it's not in a trusted location, right? That's kind of a cool reality. Identity protection, you want to know if that is a risky risky workload identity. And there's access reviews for workload identities as well as workload identity federation. So Let's move on in here to conditional access for workload identities. So you can extend conditional access policies to apps and service principals. This really starts to make me excited because I think conditional access was one of those really cool features of the P1 SKU that everybody just started implementing, right? Turning on all of the conditional access policies really helps secure your environment. You can restrict access from named locations in Azure Virtual Networks, right? So if something's happening outside of that trusted location or the Azure Virtual Network, it'll just be blocked by default. Really nice if you think about it. Then there is the whole concept here of you can view service principals that are blocked by policies by using the Insights and Reporting workbook. So let's kind of walk through this. And I also will say, too, I don't have a great way of demoing this. We're trying to work on some ways to make this be a little bit easier to showcase. But because I think it's a very important thing to showcase, I took screenshots and it'll give you that feel of where you're going in the portal. And it won't feel that dissimilar if you're familiar with how to set up conditional access already. So let's walk through what that looks like. So you'll go into conditional access like you normally would. You'll click on a new policy, create that new policy, and notice how you can specify users or workload identities. This is where you start to configure that policy assignment. Now, where do you want the policy to apply to? You've got users and groups, but if you drop that down, you'll see workload identities. And my apologies, I actually don't know if preview still shows up there. It shouldn't because this just GA'd last week. If it does, know that that will eventually be sorted. We kind of move very iteratively at Microsoft. And I don't know if you've been following too, we just recently rebranded. Now it's Microsoft Entra as the actual umbrella term for all of the identity realm within Microsoft's ecosystem. So you can actually select specific service principals, or you can select all owned service principals. In this example, there's a specific service principal that gets selected, right? And it shows all of the service principals that live in that tenant. And then you come down and you can configure the target applications the policy should apply to. So do you want it to apply to all cloud apps, no cloud apps, probably all cloud apps? Then you can specify the conditions under which the policy will apply. So you can control user access. And I wonder if that verbiage will change. But right now it says you can control user access based on their physical location. So you can include any location and then you can just exclude all trusted locations. So if something's happened from a trusted location, you know that you're not going to be worried about it. You want to know about those weird one-offs that are happening outside of the trusted locations. And then you can configure the controls themselves that will be enforced when the policy applies. Inside of this example, block access. And then you can flip the enable policy to on. If you're worried about potentially locking somebody out of an environment, you can always start with report only. It's really a matter of what makes the most sense for you. And then just hit create and boom, it's up, it's functional. You've got a conditional access policy for a workload identity, which is awesome because prior to these features, this was a big blind spot for our customers. So let's talk a little bit about the Insights and Reporting workbook next. So if you go down to Insights and Reporting, you should see this sort of getting started guide. It's like most of the Azure services. There's a lot of getting started, how to, etc. You can always just flip that to off, and then you get the awesome Insights and Reporting, right? So looks like it's Power BI. There's a lot of this that's sort of baked into the Azure portal, dependent upon if you're familiar with like log analytics or Azure Monitor, Application Insights, similar type of reporting. And then what you're able to do here is you're able to flip over to the service principal sign-ins versus the user sign-ins. So you flip over there and you start to see how your environment is looking. So in this example, there are 22 service principals, 13 have registered a success message after a run. I don't know what you want to call it, probably like a run operation. 0 are showing up as failure, and then 16, nothing wound up applying. So possibly those were running from the trusted locations. You also get a map of where those service principals or the workload identities are being run from. And then you can kind of come down here and look a little bit more. If you drill down even farther, you get more of the rich reporting that shows up within the Azure portal, right? So if you click on any one of these, you'll get more info, but you get, the service principal ID, the conditional access status. Was it success? Was it failure? Was it not applied because it was happening within a trusted location, right? So a lot of good metadata shows up in here, and it's something that you could even think about exporting if you needed to. But this workbook sort of built in out the gate, and this is sort of what you get without having to tweak too much to begin with. So then we've got identity protection for workload identities. So you can detect compromised apps and service principals, which is a really invaluable feature. There are a lot of published articles where these types of, I don't know, what do you call them, like the workload identity, like it's different based upon each cloud you might work with. But in the Azure realm, it's the 3 I spoke about earlier. So you'll hear about sometimes these things actually happening and it being very detrimental. I don't 100% know if there, any of those were Azure customers, right? I'm in the realm of I'm very outwardly focused with the community, so I don't necessarily know if any of those breaches were specifically our customers or not. But I know that these tools came as a direct result of seeing some of these breaches happen with these non-human identities. So you can block access on risky workload identities in conditional access, which is great. You can also export the risk logs using the diagnostic settings, and you can export that to Sentinel. You can export that to a tool outside of the Azure ecosystem. So if you're a big Splunk user, you could forward all of those logs into that realm. So what does this look like? Well, let's kind of walk through that next. So this is, kind of where you'll show, or where all of the workload identities will show up. So underneath risky users, there will be risky workload identities, which is great, right? It's just an extra new section to go into and drill down on the data. Inside of this, you start to see there's more similar, there's similar properties, right? So your user accounts look this way, your workload identities will work this way. A couple of differences, right? You're getting the service principal information, you're getting the app ID, you're getting the last kind of risk that was updated, right? So a little bit different, but sort of the same. You can also investigate the logs directly from this blade. So if you are doing the investigation, you can immediately drill into the logs that have been generated within this compromised application, right? You can confirm or dismiss the risk. So if you know that somebody's doing some testing and they tripped this up because you didn't set like a downtime for alerting or something of that sort, you can just dismiss it and you can go and turn off the notion of it being alerted for a duration of time. You can also disable or enable the account as well. Now, when it comes to the risk detection, it'll show up in the same area as the user detections. You'll just have this new section for workload identity detections. And these are all of the active risky detections, right? So lead credentials, risk detected. You can start to drill into each one of these and you'll get more info as to what's going on. So it'll look very familiar. You'll get the application ID, the key ID, the service principal info, and URLs when appropriate. And you can do the same thing. You can go to the very top there and you can take a look at the report. You can look at the service principal sign-in. So it's like a lot of these monitoring tools that you might be familiar with if you hang out in the realm of Sentinel, Microsoft Defender, or Azure Monitor. You can start to move around. And this is helpful if you're the one that's on the hook to figure out what's going on. So you can sort of hop around into multiple different environments and get a readout on what's happening. So let's walk through configuring a risk-based conditional access policy for workload identities. So you'll create a brand new access policy and you'll go down to the conditions. Actually, hang on. And that's where you will just say that you want to configure the service principal. I thought this one actually had another screenshot. Looks like it does not. But you just want to make sure that your service principals are being analyzed, right? If there's some weird different behavior that's not normal, you want to be flagged on it, just like your users. If all of a sudden your users are logging in from different parts of the world and they're, predominantly right around Chicago where I live, right? You probably want to know about it. Same sort of thing if your workload identities are doing things on behalf of an application and environment, et cetera, and that authentication and authorization is happening from a different part of the world. So let's talk a little bit about exporting that risk data. So there are two new data sources you can export: the risky service principals and the service principal risk events. So if you're familiar with Kusto query, these are two new tables that you could use the KQL queries against to get information, right? You could set up alerts, you could build reporting, etc. And so when you are going into your diagnostic settings, you'll want to edit that. You'll want to add these two tables, and you can specify the log analytics workspace to send it to. You can also use the checkbox and specify the retention period. You could even stream it to an event hub, right? And you can archive it to a storage account. There's a lot of great things you can do with that data, and it's pretty chatty data, or it can be, I should say. It's not always, but it can be. So it's one of those things where you've got some flexibility. You can specify the retention. You can specify that you want it to go to log analytics, to a storage account, or to an event hub for something else to suck that information up. So you've got a lot of flexibility here on how you want to see your data. Now, this is, I kind of like this one, I think, the best. The idea that you've got identity governance for these workload identities with access reviews, right? And if you've been following us on the interwebs, you saw that we just ran a swarm for identity governance. We talked quite a bit about access reviews, but we talked about it from the perspective of a user, right? And I think that's more common, but I feel like workload identities and the adoption of workload identities to run a thing for companies, this is going to become more of a hot topic as time unfolds. So you can schedule reviews of service principal assignments to Azure AD roles and Azure subscription roles. So like I talked about earlier, let's say you have a service principal with owner rights to a subscription. That's a big no-no. You don't want to have your service principals with that higher level of access. You'd probably want to run regular reviews and take a look at what service principals have access to within your environment. You can delegate the reviews to the right people as well, and then automatically revoke access of service principals denied by reviewers. So oftentimes in this realm, central IT is not a great person to decide if somebody shouldn't have access to an environment. Similarly, a lot of customers have what are called business units, and they might have different IT people working there in that realm. They might be more middleware engineers. They would probably know more about if those service principals need ownership rights to a subscription, right? I personally think it's bad posture, but sometimes you're in these weird spots where you're working with a third-party vendor and they need really elevated access, but central IT wouldn't necessarily know about it. So in this specific scenario, you may want to think about giving delegated permissions so that somebody in this business unit that knows more about the application can decide if that service principal or that managed identity should still be given that level of access. So let's walk through what this looks like, right? And it's very similar to creating an access review for a user. So you will tie this to the global admin role, right? And that's also a big problem. People will wind up having a ridiculous amount of global administrators. You may want to just take a look at this, right? So you can schedule this to happen once a month, and you can schedule it so that it looks at who has access to the global or which accounts are global administrator accounts. You can schedule the cycle So in this scenario, it's going to happen monthly, like I talked about. You can state that it will never end. If you think that it's going to be a problem that will be mitigated within 6 months, you could have an end by date, right? And then this is where you specify the service principles. So you set the scope to the service principles, and then you select the role. And in this instance, we've got a reviewer. So like I talked about earlier, central IT might not be a really good candidate to determine if this service principal should still have access to the environments the way that it does. So you'll want to have Isabel take a look at everything. And then upon completion settings, so you will want to remove access, right? So that's kind of cool, especially if the reviewers don't respond. That's a really great feature. So, you can automatically revoke access to denied and unreviewed assignments, which helps strengthen your security posture. If you think about the way back, machine, when we were still living on premises, this was always a hard thing to do unless you had some sort of governance tooling, and not every single customer wanted to spend the money for something like that. So there were a lot of security vulnerabilities because you'd have somebody come on and maybe they moved to 5 different roles over the course of their employment, and maybe they had high levels of access to certain business units or certain groups. It's one of those things that this sort of scenario can happen within the realm of service principles. Yeah, a lot of customers do tend to treat service principles like cattle. You know how we always make that joke that you should treat your cloud infrastructure like cattle? Some customers will choose to use their service principles very similarly. However, some customers will choose to use their service principles like their users. And so this is where this helps related to security posture. You can also configure additional settings, including how the reviewers will be notified. So if you are okay with email notification, you can turn that on. You can turn on reminders. You can add additional content for the reviewer email. So if you're familiar with Microsoft emails in terms of if somebody were to add you to a subscription, the same sort of email correspondence can happen in the realm of access reviews, which I think is awesome if you need some sort of audit trail, or if you need, because you never know quite what you need when the auditors do come. But I feel like everybody treats their email in a way where I think if you got an email like this, you probably wouldn't delete it. Then you've got the idea of being able to go in and look at the access review details. So just like all of the great reporting that we've got with inside of Azure and Office 365 and M365, you have the same features within the realm of access reviews, and you can go in and you can look at the results of running that access review. And you can take a look at, 2 weren't reviewed in this scenario. You can go and you can take a look at the reviewers, the results. So this is really helpful if you want to make sure that your service principles or your managed identities and your anything that falls in the realm of workload identities, you want to make sure that they're secure, and you don't want to have them all of a sudden be compromised, because those accounts can easily be elevated if they are compromised and if they have high levels of access to begin with, i.e. owner or contributor rights. You probably want to think about implementing these solutions so you can get more visibility on, do we have the right security posture in mind for our workload identities? And this takes us to Workload Identity Federation. So if you think about this, there's some background here. So managed identities are service identities whose credentials are not managed by developers, right? So this is a hot topic, right? I talked about a lot of Azure services. Probably most of them by now have a managed identity or something in the works for it to reach general availability. We like the fact that nobody has to worry about any of the secrets. So you spin up a managed identity, that managed identity handles the credentials for the duration that the object is there or the application is there. And so you can assign the identity to Azure resources. You can assign the identity to app services, to functions, to logic app storage, VMs, etc. Right? And this is all token-based authentications from Azure Active Directory. But again, you don't have to worry about it. There's a lot of things though that happen outside of Azure, right? So think about it. There's a lot of hybrid scenarios or things that handle the things that deploy into Azure from other environments that you can't necessarily control as well as you would like to, or have the level of control that you might be looking for. So that's when workload identity federation comes into the mix. So several scenarios require developers to manage secrets for Azure AD service principles where the secrets are stored securely and rotated regularly. So some of these examples are GitHub Actions and Kubernetes pods, right? So I actually was a little shocked by this. I didn't realize there were as many Kubernetes clusters in the wild that weren't part of some sort of managed service inside of a cloud vendor. When you think about having to manage security in the realm of the service principal and the secret, you do run the risk of having a security breach due to your secrets leaking. You might also have service downtime when secrets expire. So I used to work with customers who really understood the notion that they should be rotating their secrets. However, they didn't have some sort of mechanism in place to handle plugging those secrets back in the event that they have an app service, for instance, running with that secret. So they would oftentimes have a weird unexplained outage, and it was a direct result of the security posture of them saying every 6 months that secret would be rotated. So workload identity federation allows developers to use a third-party JWT, so a JSON web token, to get access tokens for the Azure AD service principles without needing secrets. So wait, what? Like, we went from the realm of managed identities that's just handling the token-based authentication and authorization without needing to know the credentials, right? I just said kind of the same thing, but ever so slightly different in the realm of workload identity federation. So now you've got token-based authentication and authorization happening in the realm of you've got a federation in your credential, and what winds up happening is you don't have to ever share that secret with what you're deploying. So that's all handled by the realm of Azure Active Directory and your workload identity. So this is sort of how this is set up, right? You've got your external workload. So let's just say it's GitHub Actions, right? So that's a very common scenario, and that's kind of where I started playing with this. In fact, I'll give you the early foreshadowing. That's what one of my demos will actually talk about. So it will request a token to the external IDP, the external identity provider. And that external identity provider will issue a token back to the external workload. Now that external workload needs to send the external token, and then it requests the access token from Azure Active Directory. There's an app registration with the federated credential. Okay. So from there, Azure AD will check that trust. It will validate the external token, right? Then it will go back and it will issue the access token to the external workload. That external workload inside of GitHub can now access resources in the realm of Azure Active Directory protected resources. So if you were to think about this, you've got a web app that deploys from a GitHub action. It needs to talk to, so there's some configuration that happens in GitHub, and then there's corresponding configuration that happens in Azure. So GitHub has to talk to Azure AD. Azure AD has to make sure that everything's trusted and that it issues a token back to GitHub, and then GitHub can effectively deploy the resources into Azure. So these are the current supported scenarios. GitHub Actions, Google Cloud. PS, I haven't played around with it. I need to. I keep saying I need to, and I don't hold myself to it. So connect with me on Twitter and force me to do it, right? Make fun of me tomorrow and tag me. And because these are the things I want to get better at, right? Workloads running on Kubernetes. I know that my colleague Christos, this is my shout out to Christos, he has tried to make this work. And I forget if he was or wasn't successful, but at one point he was struggling. And I do think he wound up getting it working, but I just don't know the latest and the greatest because we don't always talk about what we wind up doing for fun. And maybe we should also be thought about as we're not normal people. Who does identity for fun? We do on my team. And then workloads running in compute platforms outside of Azure, right? Now, this one I think is still kind of, let's put it this way. I have for sure seen GitHub Actions, Google Cloud. the workloads running on Kubernetes. That's all documented. This is also documented workloads running in compute platforms outside of Azure. I don't know much more about the prereqs. So if you are interested, I encourage you to go look at our documentation. This is something that I need to do during some of my downtime, and just to get better at it, right? So now I'm going to move into the demo, but before I move actually into the portal and then kind of show you some of the things that I have learned, I want to talk a little bit. There's 3 different components that I will show you, right? And I will also place this PowerPoint up on my GitHub repo, and I'll share it with Chris and Abdul. That way you can share it out to the folks that might be watching this on demand. So as I'd mentioned, there's GitHub configuration, there's Microsoft configuration, and there's a software engineer at Microsoft that built out a really cool shell script that does all of this for you. So, and I'll show you where that all exists, but I wanted to start by saying there are 3 different spots to go dig a little bit deeper in here specifically for GitHub Actions. And because there are configuration components that have to happen in multiple spots, the same thing exists for Kubernetes, the same thing exists for Google Cloud, and the same thing exists for compute platforms not running in Azure. So just know that that's why it's been a little squirrely for me to kind of track down. But that hopefully explains a little bit as to why I haven't had enough time to go do it. I always get sidetracked with something else, right? Unfortunately, there's only 24 hours in a day. So let me do this. Okay, so this is the Microsoft article, right? And you've got the Azure portal way of doing it, Azure CLI, Azure PowerShell, federated credentials. Again, you can do it any of these ways. You create the GitHub secrets, and then there's a great YAML file, just an example YAML file to set this up. And it runs just like Azure DevOps, right? Or any of your CI/CD tooling. And all you're providing is the client ID. So the client ID, the tenant ID, and the subscription ID. So you don't have to have the secret. And then, so I will start to back out of these tabs. Then there's the bits here on the GitHub realm. I'll say there's more info on Microsoft, but there's enough here that if you started here, you would just need a little bit on the Microsoft realm to set it up, right? This is John Gallant's bit, and the thing I like the most is he actually describes this pretty well. He even goes so far as to talk about the ways the tokens get sent and received, talks about the Azure setup, the Azure CLI. So this is the actual script itself, OIDC, so OpenID Connect.sh, that's the shell script. And then you can just run it. Now you can also run it in a dev container too. So that's kind of cool. So if you don't have this all the way set up, if you were to run this and you were able to log in, maybe to Azure Cloud Shell, you could get this sort of set up without a lot of extra effort. But because I'm a glutton for punishment, always, I will walk you through a little bit of how to set this up. Now, this is one of my tenants, right? Shakeen. Remember I said my last name is pronounced Keen. This was a nickname from high school. So my sister's name is Alyssa Keen. No, it's not. She got married. And I'm Shannon Kuehn. And so she was a Keen and I was Shakeen. So that, little fun trivia from the way back machine. So you'll go down here to app registrations. And I already have one built out, right? So GitHub OIDC 001. If you're curious, you just create the new registration and then you don't have to set up a redirect URI in this instance, but it's literally as simple as hitting register. But since I already have this created, I won't create a new one. And if you're familiar with the blades that sort of show up after you configure an app registration, you'll go down to certificates and secrets. Now, normally you'll be here, but see what I've got over here now? Federated credentials. So now I can use this credential if I create a PR or if I create a branch. So if you come in here, and I think this is even older too, because I think now you've got the GitHub Actions, right? So, but because it's still OpenID Connect, That's that little bit that's sitting up above OAuth, kind of spread over the top, the sprinkles, so to speak. This still works, but they made it easier since I set this up. You can even set this up right here. And this is the issuer. So this is the token.actions.github-user-content.com. This is the subject identifier, and this is the audience. You could edit this. I don't recommend doing it unless you know exactly what you're doing. And then you would just, go from there. So what does this look like, right? Because again, that's the Azure side of it. It's pretty straightforward, and that's why I chose not to really set it up. The bigger piece is over here in the realm of GitHub. So I've got, GitHub Actions OIDC, right? I've got some secrets set up, right? But they're not like regular secrets because again, it's the client ID, the subscription, the tenant ID. There is no secret at all whatsoever. No secret. Pretty cool, right? So you don't have to ever worry about secrets expiring, apps going down. There's no bad day like a production app going down, bad day, right? You don't have to worry about it in this instance. You're just using the client ID, the subscription ID, and the tenant ID. So what does this look like? So you can go into the workflows, and I took the bare bones YAML on the tutorial. So I've got the client ID, the tenant ID. I've played around with this a bunch. You can tell I added some commit messages in here, right? So, that's always the way to do it, right? You just use your £, and that won't be run. But it's pretty straightforward, right? So run Azure login with OpenID Connect and PowerShell. The permissions are just the ID token can write, the contents can read. It's using the latest Windows. I believe it is. I forget the GitHub, so you can make fun of me about that also on Twitter. But it's using the Windows latest version, and it's going to just literally get the Azure resource group, and it's going to select the Azure resource group name. Now, granted, I chose not to do a super sophisticated example because of the fact that I think just showing that this works and showing how to make it work is way more important than some massively sophisticated example, because you can take that massively sophisticated example and you can sort of plug it in here. So let's go back to the code. Let's you can tell I did this once. Let's change this to an extra sentence after I deleted the previous sentence. So cool. Now remember, I set this up so that if I do anything, right, PR or branch, this will all kick off and it will auto-magically work. So I'm committing the changes. Now let's go to actions. So check it out here. It is running. Now it's queued. And you want to go into here. This will take a little bit of time. It's waiting for, it's a distributed system, right? So it's got to wait for an available. Oh my God, I'm like running out of words. It's too late in the day. It's waiting for the agent to run. And so it's setting up the job. I also just recently adopted, and I feel like some of that is, I've got mom brain. It's a legit thing. So now it's using the OIDC login to the Azure public cloud with AZ PowerShell. This takes a little bit of time. So look again, client ID, tenant ID, subscription ID, no secret. How am I doing on time? I'm doing pretty good on time. Cool, cool. It's using the OIDC authentication. This is the federated token details. Now it's going to get the resource group with the PowerShell action. Because again, all I asked it to do was grab the, so here it is, all the little bits here. It's going to convert it to JSON as the output, and it should just give me all the resource groups. Now, granted, this is my Visual Studio subscription, so I don't have a lot going on in there because it's only $150 a month. And so these are all the little bits that sort of just happen. I've been meaning to figure out, it's sort of like those, if you ever built anything in Visual Studio, the deploy Azure resource, I think some of that just shows up here auto-magically. And And it's still running. So now it's running the actual PowerShell script. It's a lot of extra effort. So now you know, like, you can do some pretty sophisticated stuff in here, just like if it was running in Azure DevOps. And there we go. So the resource groups are here, and you get a complete job, and it's cleaning up the orphan processes. And so that's sort of the end-to-end bit. But the big piece is no secrets, right? You don't have to worry about, plugging in a new secret in the event you want to rotate your secrets. You just need to set up a federated credential. It makes it a lot easier in the realm of your security posture. So let me go into the resources slide next. First off, the takeaways, right? So you can now detect attacks against your workload identities. You can also control access based on risk. You can export that data to your platform of choice, right? Just like any other monitoring solution inside of Azure, whether it be for monitoring specifically or anything related to security, that can be exported to wherever it needs to be exported. You can reduce risk and increase security by extending access reviews capabilities beyond user accounts. That one I think is my favorite, just because of the fact that you never had this visibility prior to these features. And now that you do, guess what? You can go in and you can determine, do my service principals or do my workload identities, do they have the right levels of access throughout my environment? And you can also federate workload identities using the token-based authentication without the secrets. So I've also put the resources here as well. So workload identities, workload identity federation, Azure Active Directory conditional access for workload identities. I should also change all of the previews. I don't know if you paid attention, last week was RSA. So that's where all of these announcements came out. And that's why you saw the Entra change as well. And then create an access review of an Azure resource and the Azure AD roles in PIM. So there's a section in there that focuses on workload identities, and then securing workload identities with Azure AD identity protection, right? And then I also link to the workload federation documentation as well to help you understand how to set this up within GitHub, and then you'll get a token from Azure Active Directory without having to get the actual secrets. And that takes me to the end. So thank you to Chris. Thank you to Abdul. This has been fun. I don't know if there are any. Oh, it dawned on me too. I probably should have checked to see if there are any questions. I don't see any. And then I do have a slide for questions.
I did not see any questions coming
Okay.
in. And I know Abdul just stepped away for a second, but here, we'll reset our stage. There we go. Much better. Thank you, Shannon.
Yay!
That was awesome. Awesome.
Oh, good. Good.
Hey, if no one else has questions, I have a few questions.
Sure, go for it.
So, of course, backstage, I'm sitting there, you're like, who does identity for fun? I'm, putting my hand up. I know no one saw that, but that was me. I was totally doing it. I'm a kid, we're talking about.
I think, yeah, you were talking about this. I think you and I, we were chatting about this a little bit on Twitter, weren't we?
Yeah.
Yeah, it was you and I. Yeah. So
totally. I mean, it's like I'm sitting here. It's like, all right, so I have one hook under my desk that has FIDO keys. I have something behind me that's got like a little, Play Kubernetes cluster that I had from a few years ago. So, anyways, I digress. The question that I really, the question that I had was, as you can tell, like I'm excited about this stuff, but are there any takeaways that you have for the rest of the community? Something that like somebody wants to run out and start doing some bits and pieces, like maybe the access reviews.
Sure.
Is there like where could I get started and not really totally like mess up an environment, but kind of pace myself through some of these changes?
Oh, sure, yeah. So I would think starting with a conditional access policy that's report only for your workload identities. I think that would be a really good way to get started, and you don't block something, because the same telemetry that shows up when something bad happens shows up in the report only area too. So I think that would be a good way to sort of get started. You do need the Azure Active Directory P1 license SKU. A lot of customers pick P2 because you get all of the goodies of P1, plus you get the access reviews, the entitlement management, the identity governance goodies, right? So a lot of customers already have the right licensing for this. And you don't have to worry about licensing workload identities. You just need to have an Azure AD P1 to run your conditional access for workload identities, and then a P2 for your access reviews. And like I said, most customers do have at least one P2 license because it is such a hot topic right now in the realm of identity governance, because it's so hard because people are accessing things from all over. The people that went home to work aren't the same people that are coming back to the office right now.
Right.
More and more customers have learned to work in this hybrid world, and they've learned to just let their end users use whatever device they need to access whatever they need to access, so long as the IT functions can see what they're doing that's considered business based, and they can actually maintain what they're doing on that device so they're not doing nefarious things.
Right.
I think more and more people have gravitated to deploying the P2 license SKU. So I think things like report only. You can turn on the risky stuff without having conditional access block anything. So that would be another way to sort of start in on things. So flipping that on, it's the same way of flipping it on for users. You just flip it on for service principals or the workload identities realm, and you'll get some info on the risky detections. And you can just set it up so nothing happens, right? That you just kind of get a report on it. You can even set it up so you get an email about it. If I'm not mistaken, I think it's how I learned how to set it up
Right.
originally. Was I got an email alert when something was considered risky, right? So I think there are ways to get started with it. The tricky part, though, is most folks that are like developers or most folks that are kind of in the trenches on a day-to-day basis may not necessarily have the same access to Azure Active Directory as somebody on the IAM team. So I think that's the one thing to pay attention to is I know more and more shops kind of blend all of the roles together, but there still are these big enterprises that might be able to make use of these things. And so I would say if you are one of those bigger companies, and this does sound like an awesome opportunity, find a friend that has the right access, build the use case. And like I said, do the report only, turn on risky identity protection, the risky sign-ins, right? You'll start to generate data and you can start to show that to upper management so that they can give you the official head nod of yes, turn it on, yes, block this, right? So I think that's the only ever so slight caveat is some of the folks kind of in the trenches doing the day-to-day may not have the right levels to Azure Active Directory. So just make a friend in that realm. And usually if you show them why it's important, right? That it's all of these identities that normally had no way to be able to see what's going on. Now you've got ways of doing it. I guarantee you they're going to be like, oh yeah, no, because everybody's hearing about some of these breaches, right? The idea that they're, non-human accounts that are being breached.
This is awesome. One of the other things that came to mind too. So I'm excited about the Workload Identity Federation stuff. I saw that and I'm like, this is great. And I'm sitting here thinking, I remember a few years back where I had this discussion with my DBA and we're talking about, we really need to get off. We have a SQL managed account, he's going through and rotating the password. I'm like, can we just use a GMSA? Can we please?
Right.
So we went
At
through
least.
the group managed service account or managed service account, and he goes, well, what's the password? I go, doesn't matter. I go, just put a $sign at the end of it. And that was the end of the conversation for me. And he's like, what do you mean? Just put a $sign at the end. I'm like, I wanted to ask you for the account. Just put the $sign. That tells the machine Active Directory that it needs to go and retrieve it, and it's just magical. Yeah. And he looks, and of course, he used a few words that I probably shouldn't use here, but he's like, "This is incredible. This changed my life." And I feel
and
this is the same chance we can have the same conversations again.
Very much so. Yeah, GSMAs were sort of like the unsung hero on premises, and nobody gravitated towards them. But I think also too, it was kind of around the same time that Azure Active Directory was kicking off in general, or at least had started to become a little bit more mainstream. So I don't know if one overshadowed the other. Like I don't know if you follow the grunge music scene, but Smashing Pumpkins weren't as popular as Nirvana because Nirvana and Smashing Pumpkins came out at the same time, and Nirvana got more radio play. So Smashing Pumpkins, I mean, they've been around long. I think, well, no, probably about the same amount of time. But they had to wait a couple of years, sort of kind of showcase their ability as a band, right? So I think it was kind of the same sort of thing. Like GSMAs were a little bit newer in the realm of Active Directory, and I think at the same time people were also like, "What is this Azure Active Directory?" And the weird part about it is, I wish we would have figured out the naming convention a little bit, because Azure Active Directory is neither Active Directory nor Azure. It's really like that. It kind of sits like one layer up above kind of that in that realm, because it's something that's considered a global service, right, but it's not tied to a region, right? And you need it to get into the Azure realm. So it's neither Azure nor Azure It's either Azure nor Active Directory. That's how we word it.
And then one question I guess I'm going to ask is licensing always comes up, and Microsoft kind of keeps changing the licenses. So, in your opinion, like what are people doing, and what's the best way?
Yeah, so it's a lot like some of the other services. So if you were spinning up decentralized identity, you just and that just recently reached GA too. At one point you needed an Azure AD P2, like just one license to be able to turn on decentralized identity for your entire tenant. The same sort of concept exists here. So if you want to turn on conditional based access for your workload identities, you just need a license in the realm of Azure AD P1. You could get that by the standalone SKU, the bundled SKUs, whatever makes the most sense for your company. Same thing with access reviews, right? So access reviews are part of the P2 license SKU. So you would need that. But if you got the P2 license SKU, you would then kind of by default get all of your P1 functionality too. So you just need one license to be able to sort of turn this on. Because if you think about it, what we're actually protecting are things that don't have a license, right? They are like managed identities, service principals, application registrations, right? So they're things that don't need a license SKU, but you just need to have somebody with a license in your tenant to be able to monitor these workload identities.
And I think that's what the confusion piece is, because when you on the other side, with Azure Active Directory, usually it's tied to a user
Right.
or a service, right? So that's why you have a license. But this one, as you mentioned, there's no
User.
user. So people get confused, like, how am I licensing this, and how is this going to work, right? So yeah.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's the ever so slight change. But I honestly don't even know any customer out there that's just using the basic Azure Active Directory, right? All of the goodies that are baked into P1 and P2. So many customers have, if not one, both, meaning they've got P2. So because that was always the way I used to word it, that if you bought P2, you got the P1 license. It was kind of all baked into that one SKU. So I can't think of any customer that doesn't have P2. So that's the one nice thing is you don't have to worry about buying an additional bundle. There's no changes at this point to the licensing structure, right? That could change down the road. Unfortunately, I'm not involved in that. So please don't, please don't get too mad at me. As far as I know, they're not changing that too much, right? So it's kind of like also too, if you've got P2 and you invite a guest in, you can use conditional access against that guest account. And I want to say it's like, if it's not 10 guests, it's like 50 guests or something. It's weird. So like if you have one license SKU, you can use that up to like 50 or 10 or whatever it is.
50
and I forget. I think it's 10, but regardless, there are some interesting, I don't know. I don't want to call them loopholes. Interesting sort of like, oh, I didn't even think about that, but that makes sense. You wouldn't go and buy P2 licenses for every single guest you'd invite into your tenant, right? That's way overkill.
Makes sense.
Of course, I was thinking about one thing, and I got to check on it because the access reviews I think is fantastic. I know I've seen a few of them come through. They're general emails, but I'm curious if at some point, and maybe I can go and give some feedback to get actual details, because I know, Shannon, you talked about like, here's the use, like here's how much it's being used and whatever else. I think that would almost be super valuable, like coming across in part of the access review. But I know there's some sensitive information there too. But.
Yeah, I think it gives you active URL links to sort of drill into the portal, and I think that's where you're going to get all of your detail, your I guess your more info on what's going on, or more info about that specific access review that was run. But you do get enough to say, "Ooh, I do want to click on that link, and I want to go figure out exactly what's going on," because I didn't even know that service principal had ownership rights to a subscription. Right? I always use it as kind of like
majority,
like because it's super scary. Because it's one of those things too. Like the AZ CLI was super easy to set up a service principal and set it up with high level privileges, and folks didn't realize that people were spinning up service principals with high privileges until they had these types of breaches happen, right? And it's not just Azure, it's any cloud provider, right? Or because even in the realm of on-premises, right, you still have GSMA accounts, although it's harder to hack those accounts, but you've got your traditional service accounts on premises that have passwords, and they could also be breached as well. So there's this heightened awareness, heightened, I guess, focus on trying to figure out how to mitigate these accounts that aren't being run by an actual human being.
Awesome. Well, Abdul, any other questions? Any other?
No, I really want to thank Shannon. Right, Shannon, thank you so much for
Sure.
amazing session. Definitely learned quite a bit myself, and yeah, glad you could
Yay.
make it up here. And then hopefully the audience and the community is going to learn quite a bit from this too.
That's our hope too. Yeah. So I thanks for the opportunity. This was a fun one. I'm glad you guys kind of spun this up, and thank you for thinking of me. I'm literally very, very honored. You kind of just go about your day and you don't really think that people are paying attention, but then you realize no, people are paying attention, and it's an opportunity to get out and connect with both of you. So hopefully one of these days we actually do get to meet in person and we're not just two-dimensional, because I know that we're all 3D behind the scenes, right? And we can kind of put COVID behind us at some point, right?
Oh, exactly. You guys should come over across the pond, like come to Toronto. We'll go out and party and whatnot.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, I still, that's on my list of places. I've met more people in the Toronto area over the course of COVID, surprisingly, and I've been told I need to get out there.
See, my pond might be a little bit bigger because most of the people that I met were from the UK, so I might have to go a little bit further. But
yeah, same.
I'll stop in Toronto too.
Yeah. Stop in Toronto before you go over to the UK, right? Because there's probably a good one. What would be like one flight all the way over there, right? Don't have to worry about taking a connecting flight.
Yeah,
absolutely. All right. Well. Thank you again, Shannon. We really appreciate it. Thank you to our community, and we can't wait to host more of these events. So thanks, everybody. Have a great night. Have a great day. Have a great morning, wherever you may be, and see you next time.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.